hands-on technical skills, especially being a fighter pilot. Those are very specific. So I could have taken those and gone into commercial aviation. But I think the more important ones and the ones that are kind of overlooked sometimes by veterans themselves, as well as potential employers that are looking to hire people coming out of the military, are really the unique soft skills that we have. And I think a big one is just the ability to persevere, to have that grit. That's normal for people that have been in the military for a while. We're always put in stressful environments where things go wrong, obstacles pop up, and the idea of quitting generally doesn't even cross people's minds. It's just not an option. So I think we're very good at just identifying those, accepting them, and figuring out how to overcome them. So I think that's a unique trait. And then another one is really the trust and teamwork and camaraderie part of it. In the military environment, you're often put in pressure cookers and stressful situations. And there can be some negatives to that, but a positive is the level of trust that you form with the people around you. And I think you take that ability to the civilian side as well, where you have to show up for the person next to you, but you're also willing to open yourself up to really rely on them and trust them. And so kind of just that acceptance and that expectance of that kind of culture of trust can be a huge asset outside the military as well. So I always think of it as a pyramid where the foundation is really your credibility in the role that you're in. So especially when you step into a new career field, as a woman, when it's mostly men, you will be under a microscope a little bit. I wish that wasn't the case, but I think it's generally true. People are looking to see how you do. And I think that first step is to get really good at your job, to put in the work to create that credibility. And that's kind of twofold. It creates credibility for the people that are looking at you and watching, but it also gives you the confidence to know that you belong there and know that you're good enough to be there. So once you kind of create that, I think some additional things that can really help out is finding your allies. There might be other women you can look up to, but it might be men as well, people that are willing to support you, that are willing to speak up on your behalf when you're not in the room. And finding those people is key. And one of the parts of doing that is being willing to be a little bit vulnerable. I know when I was young in my career field, I put up this front, this barrier of perfection, right? I wanted to prove myself. I wanted to always have the answers. I didn't want to show weakness. And that came with, holding myself back some because I wasn't really learning from my mistakes, because I wasn't taking risks to make those mistakes. But I also kept any potential mentors at arm's length because I wasn't willing to open up to them and know when I need to ask for help and be a little bit vulnerable. So I think, creating that credibility by being really good at your job, finding your mentors, being willing to be vulnerable with them, and then opening yourself up and realizing that you're learning, especially if it's a new career for you. You will make mistakes. You will have things you don't know how to do initially, and just accepting that and being okay with it, being willing to admit those mistakes and learn from them, and accept that you have to go through the learning process and that it's not going to be perfect. So the biggest challenge for me was actually my own self-doubt. Um, I was a pretty introverted and shy kid growing up, and I still was a thrill seeker and adventurous and driven. So that kind of led me to decide I wanted eventually to be a fighter pilot. And that drive took me all the way to making it there, which there's not a lot of fighter spots available coming out of Air Force pilot training. So it was definitely very competitive. I got there. I was really proud. My parents were really proud. I just kind of done well at everything. And then I got into the actual career field. It was much harder than I had ever imagined. And so all of a sudden, kind of running up against this wall where no matter how much work I put in, no matter how hard I studied, I still felt like I was just not very good at it. I had this moment where I suddenly did not think I belonged there. And so if you're familiar with imposter syndrome, I definitely had a serious case of that. So that kind of led to me putting up this front that I had to prove myself, not wanting to show people that I didn't know things. When I distinctly remember when I would have questions, that I would just keep them inside and I wouldn't raise my hand to ask them because I didn't want everyone around me to realize how little I knew, because I felt so much like I had to prove myself because I didn't actually belong there. I was, sneaking under the radar, made it to this amazing elite position, and I didn't actually deserve it. And so I struggled with that for probably the first 3 years, my first assignment in a combat squadron, and overcoming it took some time. And the big thing that allowed me to overcome it, I moved to a new base, which was in Texas. So I'm, a little bit more experienced at this point. And I kind of reflected back on that first assignment. And I realized how many opportunities I had let pass me by. Because when things would come up that, they were looking for volunteers to lead something or go do something, I would not raise my hand and volunteer because that came with a chance of failing and also a chance of other people finding out that I didn't belong there. And so I would shy away from any of those opportunities. And so that physical move allowed me to reflect on that a little bit. And I realized how much I had held myself back. And so I made this promise to myself that I was going to recognize when those opportunities popped up, because they always came with this initial excitement. I was like, oh, I should go do that. But then that immediately was followed by that gut drop of apprehension and fear of maybe I don't have the skills to go do this thing yet, or maybe that puts me in the spotlight and I don't want to be in the spotlight. And so I was like, I'm going to find those things. And when I get that feeling, I'm just going to say yes to them. I'm not going to overthink it. I'm just going to be the one that's like, yep, I'll do it. I'll go. And so I started doing that. And I think a big key takeaway from that is that it wasn't a huge transformation overnight. It took a little bit of time. It took starting small. I actually started doing it first in my hobbies outside of work. I got into some extreme sports that I'd always wanted to get into, but that were outside my comfort zone, like mountaineering and rock climbing. I did some solo international traveling. All those things kind of built my confidence that then started to move into my work life. And on that front, I started to say yes to smaller things that I previously wouldn't have. And, a year to a year and a half later, my tolerance level for what felt uncomfortable had gone up so much that I was saying yes to all these amazing things, and the rewards were incredible. And that's what finally gave me the courage to consider even applying to be a Thunderbird pilot, because that was pretty intimidating. And there was a long time when it intrigued me, but I didn't think I was actually good enough to go do the job. And so there's a little bit of self development and growth that had to happen to get me to the point where I had the courage to go do this thing that I didn't initially have the skills to do, but I was able to figure it out along the way. And that's kind of the mentality I've adopted since then. And it's really paid off. So if you've ever seen the Thunderbirds fly or seen any of the cockpit recordings, you know that a key part of performing at that level is an insane amount of trust. I think that's the cornerstone to a high performing team in and out of the military. You have to be able to trust that the person next to you is going to pull their weight, and when you need them, that they're going to be there. And the same goes for you as an individual. You have to show up for the people around you. And so one of the things that I kind of found after flying for the Thunderbirds is that there were a few key attributes that really allowed us to foster that extreme level of trust. I always call it the culture of trust. One of the big things is that the mission of that team is very clear. Everyone knows that the mission is to recruit, retain, and inspire, and everyone's heavily invested in it, right? It's a competitive process to be part of that organization, so everyone's motivated to be there and they understand the mission. So I think that's the first one, a common goal or a common mission that everyone understands. After that, I think it's really clear expectations. People need to know what is expected of them, how they have to show up every day. And quickly following that is feedback and accountability. So I think the military is pretty good at this, and especially the elite units, where if someone starts to stray away from those expectations, they are quickly corrected back. It's not in like a shameful way, but it's in a way like, hey, we need you as part of this team. We're relying on you. And as long as you're willing to have those tough conversations right away and make a timely correction through feedback, it doesn't have to blow up into this big dramatic thing where the performance of the team suffers. And then finally, the last one I think is really ownership. And so people, when they have clear expectations, when they're given consistent feedback and they understand how they contribute to the overall mission, they're more willing to take ownership of their role and also ownership of their mistakes. And so you create this culture where people don't hide their mistakes, and they fess up to them, and they're willing to present them to the group as something that everyone can learn from. And that really allows the entire organization to get better together. And that really creates that foundation of trust that leads to those organizations being able to perform at a high level. So I like to think of mental toughness or grit like a muscle. So if you want to get stronger, you would go to the gym. You would start at a lighter weight, and over time and repetition, you would build up, and you'd look back 6 months later or a year later, and that weight you had started with that felt fairly difficult is now super easy. And so you can't go from being very comfortable and not having to work your mental toughness muscle at all to all of a sudden being put in a really extreme situation that's maxing you out. I think the way to do it is to gradually build that tolerance. And a part of that is knowing your people and knowing where their threshold is, because there's a fine line of pushing everyone enough to get outside their comfort zones and face their fear a little bit where they're growing quickly. But if you push them too far, people will quit, people will shut down, and you kind of start to have diminishing returns. So a big part of that is understanding where each person on your team is at and knowing when something pops up that's going to push that person, who the right person for the job is, and be like, okay, you are the perfect candidate to go do this thing because I know it's going to be uncomfortable for you. It's going to force growth, but I also know you can do it. And so I think over time, if you do that for everyone on your team, all of a sudden you've created this organization where the threshold discomfort that used to be low has raised incrementally over time. And all of a sudden you look back, you don't even recognize the team you used to be. And others are looking up to your organization like, how do they consistently perform at that level? And, you know, it's small steps repeated over and over, but you can actually get there pretty quickly.